fellow bibliophiles, and welcome back to Blatantly Bookish. Today, I am here with Katie from Books and Things for Jane Austen July. We just finished reading Emma, and we were going to discuss it with each other and hopefully hear from you guys and your reading in the comments below. So Emma is one of my favorite Jane Austens. It's either one or two. Pride and Prejudice was the first Jane Austen book I read, and so I think it's number one. We'll find out a little later in the month as we keep reading. But I know, Katie, it's not always your favorite. So how was rereading it?
Yeah, I really loved this reread. I definitely liked it more this time than I had before. So this is my third time reading Emma, I think. And definitely it has never been my favorite Austen. It hasn't been my least favorite Austen, but it's always been like definitely in the middle. Whereas I feel like this time I enjoyed it much more, and it would probably like knock Persuasion out of like number 3. So Pride and Prejudice is still my favourite, and Mansell Park is still my second favourite, but I feel like Emma could be my third favourite. And I definitely liked it much more this rereading.
Yeah, I always have trouble ranking Jane Austen books in general, and I've like never made a video about ranking them because I've read them all to such varying degrees. So Emma is probably the book I've read second most. I've read it 3 times now, maybe 4 times, but Persuasion I've only read once.
Yeah, and I'm sure the next time I reread Persuasion, I might decide I love it more than Emma. And Jane Austen is so good that she is one of those authors that whichever book you're reading, you become really fond of because she is just so good.
Yeah, unless it's Sense and Sensibility, which for some reason always ranks fairly low for me, that whatever book I'm reading is my favorite at the moment.
Yeah, I think I got on with Emma as a character much better this time because I sometimes find Emma a bit dislikable, but I feel like this reread I just liked Emma much more as a character, and I got on with her better. Always thought she had a very good like character arc and good character development, but I feel like I felt like her heart was in the right place in a way that maybe I hadn't before in the same way, and I just really enjoyed reading about her because I think there are a few moments where Emma sort of behaves badly that I found like not exactly cringy, but I found like disappoint me, and I feel disappointed in her as a character, whereas this time I didn't really feel like that. Like I feel like I was more invested with her from the beginning.
Yeah, and for me it was almost the opposite this time around. I'm always so invested in Emma and so blinded by Emma and everything she thinks and does, and it all just makes sense to me at the time. But this time when I was reading, I was paying a lot closer attention to everyone else's point of view, Mr. Knightley, Mrs. Weston, and some little clues about Jane and Frank that usually I don't pay attention to. I'm just so enthralled by Emma, but this time I wasn't. And I still liked her though somehow.
Yeah, I also think I remembered that Emma took like more time to get going than other Austens, but actually I think reading it this time, I felt really invested from the beginning, and she's so set up as a character right away. And actually like, although it is a sort of more self-contained Jane Austen novel in that they don't leave Highbury, they don't go far away, there's no travelling, the plot doesn't have like the same kind of stages as some of her other books. Actually, like the plot is really good, and it's one of the Jane Austen books that has like a really good twist. And I think the Jane and Frank plot and like noting all of the like little hints that we get towards Jane and Frank along the way are actually, that's really good, and that's a really interesting part of the novel as well, especially on a reread. It's really good fun.
Yeah, it's really fun on a reread to try and piece things together, and it's interesting how the perspectives of all the different characters really shift as you reread the book again and again.
I think as well, like my enjoyment of the minor characters has changed as well. Like I remember the last time I read Emma, I found, not necessarily I found Miss Bates annoying, but I found like all her long speeches really quite dull. Whereas I think this time I enjoyed reading her long passages more, and I found it quite interesting because actually there's lots of like little interesting details just in her just in the passages that she speaks, and there's so many like little things, especially actually there are hints about Frank and stuff, even though Miss Bates doesn't know about it. There's things that she says in her long speeches that you can learn from and that give you a good sense of Highbury and the place, because actually like considering Miss Bates is not that a man of an important character, there are like pages and pages and pages of her just talking, and actually I think previously I found that a bit annoying, and this time I really enjoyed it and I like looked at it and focused on them more. I think
I felt the same way, and I think this time that might have been because I was listening to an audiobook as I was following along in the print form. So when I do that, I don't really skip words or passages as easily. I have to actually listen to the whole thing. And so I actually took the time to really hear what Miss Bates had to say this time which I feel like a lot of times I just kind of skim through what she has to say, which I shouldn't, because she is such an important character, and in a lot of ways she is the source of information for Highbury.
Yeah, I feel like the reading experience does make a big difference. Like this time, I think as well, because I was mostly following the read along schedule, so I was reading just a few chapters a day, I probably like took it in more and enjoyed it more rather than like reading it more quickly, I suppose. And also I think the last time I read it was when I used to work at the Jane Austen Centre in Bath, and like basically because sometimes the museum had quiet days, you're allowed to read like in the museum if there was no one in the exhibit with you, as long as you were reading Jane Austen. So I would like sit there and read my Jane Austen book until some visitors arrived, and then I put my book down and go and say hello to them. So I probably was reading it in like an interrupted way as well.
I love that. I love the idea that you're just sitting in the Jane Austen Center reading Jane Austen, waiting for people to come over. Emma is, I quite love Emma as a heroine. I think that she's kind of a strange heroine in that she's not as perfect as the other main characters, but that's why I love her so much, and that's why Mr. Knightley loves her so much. I'm just quite partial to Emma, despite a lot of people's problems with her.
But it's interesting, you and I were talking about how like she maybe has more in common with some of the less pleasant characters in Jane Austen, rather than the typical heroines. Actually, she's got some things in common with sort of Mary Crawford and Miss Bingley and stuff. But actually, because her heart's in the right place, even though she doesn't always show it in the right way, she isn't quite like them, and she is really likable. Because you know that she means well, even though she doesn't know how to show it, even though she is a bit selfish, even though she can be a bit of a snob. Her intentions are fundamentally good, and also she does learn throughout the book. She learns. And I think her character development is really good.
Yeah, and we see her learning, we see her growing, we see that all of the hurt and pain that she causes for Harriet and for any other character in the book, Jane also, she realizes that, and she does indeed learn from it. But I do sometimes wonder if we heard maybe Mansfield Park from Mary Crawford's point of view, or maybe not Pride and Prejudice from Miss Bingley's point of view, but you know what I mean. If we heard from some of these other women who do have a lot in common with Emma, would we be more sympathetic towards them? Or is it just because Emma is so Emma that we feel for her?
Yeah, because I do think, like, actually, if it's interesting to look at Emma in comparison to Mary Crawford in Mansfield Park, because I think the character of Jane Fairfax has quite a lot in common with Fanny Price. And, you know, she's criticised with her about her sort of excessive reserve, Jane Fairfax is, which is definitely something you could say is true of Fanny Price. And maybe the way Mary Crawford sometimes feels about Fanny Price is quite similar to the way Emma feels about Jane Fairfax, that she just can't get to know her. And that makes it a struggle. So I do feel like, yeah, we get to see in Emma's head, and she gets to become a slightly better person, even though to begin with she has quite a lot of similar traits to some of the like less nice women in Austen.
And I also really love the idea of thinking of Jane Fairfax and Fanny Price together, because in a lot of ways they're very similar characters in their reserve, like you were saying. But I think, or I wonder if Jane's reserve is kind of a bit of a smokescreen for everything that's going on. She realizes she can't show all of her inner turmoil at the moment. But I suppose Fanny's the same way. She realizes that, you know, to hold her position at Mansfield Park, she can't show that either. Just like it's not proper for Jane to show everything that's going on because it's a secret engagement. It's quite improper, in fact. So, and also thinking about Emma in contrast to someone like Mary Crawford, it's interesting to compare Emma to somebody who's just already in the book, to Frank Churchill, because similarly, they both have this arc of, well, redemption in some ways, to varying degrees. Emma obviously learns from everything she's been through, but I feel like we're more sympathetic towards her because we're hearing the story from her point of view, whereas I don't know if I actually ever forgive Frank.
It's interesting because there's that scene where later in retrospective, you know that he almost tells Emma about his relationship with Jane Fairfax, and he says something like, you know, I don't think you can be without suspicion that, and then they're interrupted. And I think that scene's like incredibly important because he sort of wants to tell her because they're friends. And it's interesting, like in quite a lot of the adaptations, in quite a lot of films, that scene gets cut. The 2009 one with Ramona Gray keeps it in. And I feel like it completely changes Frank's character, whether or not you have that scene, because that scene is sort of the moment where he almost tells her the truth because he wants to. And actually, you can see that he doesn't like pretending and he doesn't want to pretend. And that him and Emma have a friendship that he would like to confide in her. But at the same time, like, Emma has completely misread him. And I guess as well, like, Emma sort of prides herself on being a good judge of character, and sort of she thinks she's observant, she thinks she's good at like making matches, she thinks she is really, really kind of intelligent and good at reading people. And Frank thinks that she is too, because he's been told so by Mrs. Weston and Mr. Weston. So as far as Frank's concerned, Emma should be able to work it out, because that's the like persona she gives to everyone, but she's completely not, and she isn't able to work it out at all. Because actually she's not so observant and kind of emotionally intelligent as she thinks she is.
And I feel like all the characters give her so much credit for being so emotionally intelligent and so observant. And she is the least observant person in the book, except for maybe Harriet. But yeah, I think I do. And this reading, I did actually forgive Frank for his conduct towards Emma. I didn't forgive Frank about his conduct towards Jane. And I don't see how she forgave him. But that's clearly not a part of the story that we're really privy to.
Yeah, I do think like a Jane Fairfax retelling of Emma would be super interesting, because she is a really interesting character, and there's so much like plot going on behind the scenes that we only know a little bit about. Like, they clearly have a massive argument, and like she nearly breaks off the engagement and she's going to go become a governess, and there's obviously this like huge dramatic love story going on beneath the surface, and this big like complicated mess between them that we only really get a little bit of knowledge of at the end, which I think is really interesting, because it's sort of this, yes, we have the main love story at the front, we have Emma and Mr. Knightley, but actually there's another big love story in Emma that we only really ever see the tips of, and we don't really know that much about, even at the end.
And the end is so interesting because it's constantly comparing Emma and Mr. Knightley's relationship to Frank and Jane's relationship. It's constantly putting those two against each other and showing how nice and smooth and easy Emma and Mr. Knightley are, and then how tumultuous Frank and Jane's love story is.
Exactly, which I guess is partly to do with like money and wealth as well, because Mr. Knightley and Emma have sort of more independence, I suppose, because of their wealth. And obviously that's not completely, you know, they are going to end up moving in together with Emma's father, because Emma feels she can't leave him because he is her dependent on her, basically. But also Jane and Frank not having money, and Frank being dependent on his aunt and uncle, has meant they've had a very different love story, because they don't, especially Jane, don't really exist in the same class as Emma and Mr. Knightley.
Yeah, they don't. They do, but they don't. They definitely still will interact with each other when possible. But it's very clear that Emma and Mr. Knightley do come from a more privileged situation than certainly Jane and also Frank.
Yeah, and I do think all the stuff about class and money and rank in Emma is really interesting, because I think Emma's like the wealthiest of Jane Austen's heroines. Like, she's the one who doesn't really have any financial worries in a way that a lot of Jane Austen's heroines do. And she's sort of rich and it's all fine. She doesn't need to get married for any financial reason, which for quite a lot of the other Austen characters, there is a financial motivation to get married as well. And Emma doesn't really have that. But also that like privilege that she does have affects the way she treats other people around her, and also means like she kind of gives Harriet bad advice, because she assumes, well, Harriet's my friend, so now Harriet is on an equal footing to me, when actually Harriet is from a completely different background. I think it's Emma and how she thinks about class and rank is really interesting. She's very, very dismissive of the Martins without really knowing them, but she assumes that Harriet is their equal just because she's decided that she is, and as far as she's concerned, that's the most important thing.
Thinking about Emma and class with regards to Mrs. Elton is actually also fascinating, because Mrs. Elton is sort of a smaller fish in a bigger pond, if you will. She's been elsewhere. She grew up in Bristol. She's been to Bath, and there are definitely far wealthier people than Emma in Bath. But at the same time, Emma is sort of a big fish in a small pond, because Emma is the queen bee in Highbury, and she doesn't know any better. She doesn't know anything else. And if she were to go to Bath society, perhaps she would feel humbled a bit. Or London society, to be even more exaggerated. But all Emma knows is that she's pretty much the richest in her town, apart from Mr. Knightley, it seems.
Yeah, and I think as well, like, Mrs. Elton's a really interesting figure, because Mrs. Elton sort of puts herself on a level footing with Emma and is very familiar with everyone of their class, and, you know, calls Mr. Knightley Knightley, and considers herself very worthy and, you know, sort of tries to adopt Emma as her friend and adopts Jane Fairfax in a sort of very patronising way. And I think you can see that like Mrs. Elton thinks she is on a level with Emma, and Emma is sort of appalled and astonished that Mrs. Elton dare think that.
Yeah, I think Mrs. Elton thinks that she is Emma, and even in some cases that she's better than Emma because she has experienced Bath society. But we see from everyone else that Emma's not wrong on this one, that Mrs. Elton is quite vulgar. And you were talking about how she calls Knightley Knightley, and she also calls Mr. Elton Mr. E. And we see from other characters that they don't approve of that either, that is just her being vulgar and snobbish in society.
Yeah, and her behaviour towards Jane Fairfax is always very patronising. And there's that scene where she's sort of trying to invite people to Mr. Knightley's house, and Mr. Knightley's like, no, I will do my own invitations. And I think Mrs. Elton is such a wonderful character for being very silly and over the top, but also for maybe like showing Emma a kind of snobbery that is different, and also that she can immediately see as negative.
Yeah, I think Mrs. Elton is a nice counterpoint to Emma, to show her that, yes, Emma's a bit of a snob, but she's not Mrs. Elton. That scene that you're mentioning where Mr. Knightley is talking about how there's only one person who can invite people to Donwell Abbey except himself, I love that scene. I feel like it's almost our first hint that he might be interested in marriage at some point with someone.
I wonder as well if there's a similarity to be drawn between like Emma's behaviour towards Harriet and Mrs. Elton's behaviour towards Jane, and that kind of different sort of, I am adopting this slightly younger woman as my protege, and whether there's some similarity there.
Oh, absolutely. I think that there is similarity to be drawn there. But at the same time, I think that Emma looks upon Harriet as her equal in a weird way, or as somebody who's been less advantaged than she is. She has less privilege, but she deserves to be Emma's equal. Whereas that is certainly not how Mrs. Elton looks at Jane. But it's interesting because by the end of the book, and this is not something I picked up before this reading, but by the end of the book, Emma has come to her senses when it comes to Harriet, and she no longer views them as on equal footing.
Yeah, I suppose it's interesting as well because Emma's interest in Harriet, like she wants to make Harriet marry a gentleman and sort of raise her up, whereas Mrs. Elton is very focused with getting Jane Fairfax a situation as a governess, which she doesn't actually feel she needs to be yet, and sort of keeping her in her place, I suppose. But you're right that at the end, Emma has sort of says that actually her and Harriet are on different footing, and Harriet's going to have a different life to her, but also that she accepts that Mr. Martin might be a good match for her, and that she is like happy to know Mr. Martin as well.
It's kind of sad that Emma seems to think that her relationship with Harriet isn't going to go anywhere, especially because at some point Mr. Knightley makes a reference to Robert Martin and how indispensable he is as a person to Donwell Abbey and to Mr. Knightley himself. So I can't imagine that Harriet and Emma won't interact together. But I suppose maybe not in the same way. So it's also interesting to think about Jane Fairfax and Emma's relationship. The two of them should be absolutely perfect friends on paper. They should do everything together because they're both accomplished and wonderful young girls. However, they just never hit it off. And in the course of the book, towards the beginning, that's how it's framed. But obviously, as the book progresses, we see that there's this sort of jealousy almost of Jane Fairfax towards Emma, that she sees how Emma is interacting with Frank, and it must torture her.
Yeah, and I think there's lots of different things at play, because there's Jane being jealous of Emma, and then there's also Emma being jealous of Jane without really realising it, because there's that suggestion that Mr. Knightley might be interested in Jane. And then I also think there's Emma being jealous of Jane because she knows Jane is a better person than her, and Jane is sort of the person who people think she is, really accomplished and really good, and actually she's not that accomplished, she's not that good, and she knows that she plays with feeling, but she's not as good at playing the piano as Jane, and she makes all these lists of books she wants to read, but she doesn't actually read them, and Jane is sort of the person that people think Emma is, but she knows she isn't. And I feel like Jane makes Emma feel like she's a fake, and makes Emma feel like she's not as impressive as she thinks she is and she wants to be. And I wonder if that's as well why Emma doesn't get on well with Jane Fairfax, because she kind of knows that Jane is a better person than her, but also she has the money and the advantage and the privilege that Jane doesn't have.
And then I think by the end of the book, some of the resentment that Jane is afraid she's shown Emma has just come from her secret relationship with Frank and watching Frank interact with Emma. But I wonder if that resentment is actually real. Jane thinks perhaps it's there. Emma always thinks that Jane just doesn't like her and doesn't accept her friendship, but also that she doesn't do enough for Jane. I wonder to what extent that resentment between the two is actually present in the book, and to what extent it's made up in both their minds.
Yeah, I think both of them sort of think the other one doesn't like them, and that's why they don't like each other, rather than because they actually don't like each other. And there's quite a nice bit near the end where they sort of talk to each other properly, honestly, for the first time, and actually they could have got on so much better for a long time if only they'd have been able to be more open with each other and understand each other a bit better.
Yeah, and it's kind of a shame because at the end of the book, Jane is going to move away so soon. Yeah, but they all do have that connection of family. I mean, Frank is Mr. Weston's son, and so presumably they'll all interact with each other and see each other again soon, hopefully.
What else do we need to say about Emma?
Probably addressing the age of Knightley. I don't think it's a problem, but I know that a lot of people do. I actually think that their relationship is kind of problematic, Emma and Knightley, but in the same way that Jane and Frank's is, that one of them is perfect and the other isn't.
Yeah. It's interesting, like, Mr. Knightley has always been one of my favourite Jane Austen heroes, though Emma wasn't always one of my favourite Jane Austen books. And I think previously I would have been of the opinion that Emma wasn't, like, good enough for Mr. Knightley, but I don't know if I necessarily think that, because I think in some ways they are more well-suited, and that Mr. Knightley wouldn't want to be with someone who was perfect.
The book draws our attention to the fact that Mr. Knightley's so perfect, and all that Emma could ever hope for is to grow worthy of him, that there's some implicit changing that Emma needs to do to be worthy of Knightley, in a similar way that there's some implicit changing Frank has to do to be worthy of Jane, and he calls her at the end this angel. Emma holds Mr. Knightley up to the standard of the best gentleman there is, and those are both a bit problematic because even though Jane and Mr. Knightley are excellent people, they chose who they chose for a reason. And, you know, I don't think Mr. Knightley and Jane Fairfax would have been as good together.
No, and I think, like, you see in all the debates between Mr. Knightley and Emma, I think that they quite enjoy arguing with each other, and that they would never want to, like, be with someone who they couldn't have disagreements of opinion with in an interesting and engaging way, and that they have, like, good conversations together, and yeah, kind of fight against each other in a way that can make both of them grow.
Yeah, and they just balance each other out. I mean, Knightley doesn't explicitly say it in the same way that Emma does. We really see Emma's point of view on this one, but Mr. Knightley does say towards the end of the book that he loves her faults and all, that he loves her for her faults rather than in spite of them. And I think that had he been with somebody different, it just wouldn't be the same. He wouldn't love them in that imperfectly perfect way.
Yeah, and I think as well, when he talks about the other sort of potential love interests for Mr. Knightley, I suppose, in the book are Jane Fairfax and Harriet Smith. And there are bits where he talks about the things that are for him faults in both of them, which is that Jane is so reserved and that Harriet Smith is not, like, clever enough, basically. And you can see in both of those, like, Emma is so clever, and also she's so, like, willing to argue with him, and she's so unreserved and, like, keen to talk and so extroverted, and that's kind of what he needs.
Yeah, I think class aside, because really, if you were to choose class-wise somebody who would go well with Mr. Knightley, the only person in the book, obviously, is Emma. But I don't think Jane would have been such a bad choice either. I mean, she doesn't have fortune, certainly, but she has the birth status. She's still a gentlewoman in some respect. It's not like she's a nobody.
Yeah, I think her grandfather was a clergyman, so yeah, she is in the right kind of level of respectability that it would be acceptable for her to marry Mr. Knightley.
Yeah, so that's not exactly the opposition that he faces. He really genuinely feels that she is too reserved as a person, and that the two of them couldn't get along because of it.
And I know a lot of people find the kind of age gap and the age difference between Emma and Mr. Knightley complicated and don't like it. And obviously they do have that sort of complicated surrogate brother-sister relationship to a certain extent because their siblings are married and because Mr. Knightley is a sort of close family friend who has been kind of one of their set in many ways for a long time. And that does kind of bring a different element into their relationship as well.
Yeah, and I also feel like, you mentioned the brother-sister, like a surrogate brother-sister relationship. I also feel like Mr. Knightley has a surrogate parental relationship because Mr. Woodhouse is so incapacitated by his neuroses. But at the same time, I think that both of these things, while they're incredibly problematic for a modern-day reader, they're far less problematic for that time period.
Yeah, and the same with the age difference. It's not really... it wouldn't really have been considered an especially large age difference for the time. And I think as well, because Emma is sort of 20, she's not as young as some of the other Jane Austen heroines. I think it sort of would be, yeah.
Yeah, I see what people mean, though. There is that line in the book where he says, "I've loved you ever since you were 13. And you think about the age range and the age difference. So he fell in love with her when he was 29 and she was 13. And that just seems wrong from a modern day perspective. But I think what he means is he fell in love with her person. I don't think he means it in a creepy sexual way at that point.
I think as well, like, it's important to remember that marriageable age in the Regency period for people of this class was like 15. So it's more like a 25-year-old falling in love with an 18-year-old than it is falling in love with a 13-year-old. Like it's not as below marriageable age as it would be nowadays. So yes, it is a bit weird. But yeah, it wouldn't have been considered. I don't think that line would have been read in the same way at the time as it is today.
No, not at all. I think the line would have been read very differently.
And I also think as well, like, Emma does view Mr. Knightley in a bit of a brotherly way for quite a lot of the book. Like, I think she does see him as part of her family, which he is because of the relationship between their siblings. But I also think Mr. Knightley never really views her in that way. There's that bit at the ball where she says, you know, we're not so much brother and sister, are we? And he's like, of course not, basically. He says, no, indeed. And I quite like that bit for kind of showing that Mr. Knightley definitely has never really viewed her like that. Even though there is that family link between them, it's a bit different.
Yeah, and I think it's great that Mr. Knightley has never viewed her that way, and that her mindset has come around in terms of their relationship. But also, I think because of that family connection, that's why they're able to be on such friendly terms and able to really interact and get to know each other.
And I think as well, that's how Emma like sort of deceives herself about how she actually feels towards him, because she always feels this great like sense of ownership of Mr. Knightley, basically, which means she does feel kind of jealous and annoyed whenever anyone suggests that Mr. Knightley might want to marry anyone. But in her mind, she frames it in connections with their family, because she isn't kind of ready to accept to herself that she might want to have a relationship with him that's different to that.
Yeah, and that realization when she finally does realize that that is what she wants, that scene is pretty amazing when it comes down to it, because she's just thinking about him marrying someone, marrying Harriet maybe, and all of a sudden she goes, no, nobody can marry him. Only I could marry him. And it seems to come out of nowhere, but it's been building this whole time.
Yeah. Well, it's such a good book.
Such a good book. I love Emma.
Yeah.
So I guess we should stop rambling on about Emma now, though we could probably go for a while longer, especially if we start talking about adaptations and things like that. But I would love to know in the comments below, how was your reread of Emma if you participated with us? And what do you think of all of the different characters? Does Emma irritate you? Is Frank Churchill redeemed in your mind? What do you think of all the things we talked about? And until next time, I'll see you in another video soon. Bye!